Story 1. The Mirror in Room 313. Do you hear the rain? Take a moment. Close your eyes if you want. Let that sound settle in your bones. There's something soothing about it, isn't there? That soft rhythm like a lullaby from the earth itself. Now tell me something. Where are you listening to this right now? Are you in your car? In bed? Lying on the couch with headphones on? And what time is it where you are? Because the story I'm about to tell you only ever happens at night. And only when it's raining, just like now. This is the story of Evan, a man of reason, logic, and clean-cut skepticism. He was the kind of guy who laughed at ghost stories and rolled his eyes at people who talked about energy or bad vibes. He was a claims adjuster, traveled a lot, spent more time in cheap hotels and lonely roadside motels than he did at home. He thought he'd seen everything, until one rainy night, something saw him. It was supposed to be a quick stop. The highway had flooded. His GPS led him through back roads and winding forest trails until he reached a tiny inn he had never seen before on any map, Maple Hollow Inn. It looked like it had been standing for over a century. 3 floors, faded green shutters, a sagging porch, and a neon sign buzzing faintly through the downpour. The place looked almost swallowed by trees. No other buildings around. No lights in sight. Just the steady hiss of rain and the hum of that flickering sign. He stepped inside. The lobby smelled like damp wood and forgotten years. There was a woman behind a desk, gray-haired, pale, wearing an expression that looked halfway between bored and worried. Without looking up, she said, "You can take room 313. If you're not too bothered by the mirror." He chuckled awkwardly. "Mirror?" She raised her eyes slowly. "Some guests say it reflects things that aren't really there. But we don't have many rooms left tonight." He shrugged. He was soaked, exhausted, and frankly didn't care about local folklore. "I'll take it." He walked up to the 3rd floor. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lit by low amber lights. The carpet was old and smelled faintly of mold. Room 313 was at the very end of the hall. When he opened the door, the first thing he noticed was the silence. Even with the rain outside, the room was too quiet. The second thing he noticed was the mirror. It was massive, not just big, imposing. It stood directly across the bed, framed in dark carved wood, intricate patterns like twisting vines and staring eyes. The glass itself was spotless. Too clean, actually, like someone had polished it constantly. He unpacked, took a hot shower, and sat on the bed with his laptop. Rain tapped softly on the window. The dim lamp lit the room in a golden hue. But no matter what he did, he kept glancing at the mirror. And here's where it began. At first, it was small. He moved and thought, just for a moment, that his reflection was slightly out of sync. A delayed blink, a hesitation. But every time he stared directly, it matched him perfectly. Maybe he was just tired. But that night, as he lay in bed, something kept him awake. He couldn't stop thinking about that mirror. Have you ever stared at your reflection too long in the dark? After a while, it starts to look less like you, more like a stranger, mimicking you with perfect precision. He got up, walked toward the mirror. His own tired face stared back at him. His hands trembled slightly from the cold. He leaned closer. Their noses almost touched through the glass. Then he blinked, and the reflection didn't. His heart skipped. He leaned back, trying to laugh it off. "I'm overtired," he whispered. But the mirror didn't let go. Even when he turned off the lights, laid back down, and tried to sleep, it was there, facing him, watching. That night, he dreamt of standing in that same room, But in the reflection, he was not alone. There was something behind him in the mirror, a shadow. It moved differently. It wasn't just a dream. It felt like memory. He woke up with a jolt. The air was freezing. The mirror was fogged, as if someone had breathed on it, except he hadn't. And the room was ice cold. There was no reason for fog to form. He checked out early that morning, but as fate would have it, the roads were still closed. He returned that evening, against his better judgment, back to 313. The second night, the air was heavy, thick with something unsaid. The lights seemed dimmer. The mirror looked sharper. He sat on the bed, stared at it directly, determined to prove it was all in his head. That's when it happened. The reflection began mouthing words. No sound, just lips moving, over and over. The same phrase. You left me. Evan froze. He mouthed, what? The reflection smiled. Blood began soaking its shirt, slowly from the chest down, staining everything. Evan stumbled back, eyes wide. He turned on every light, paced, tried to call the front desk, but no one answered. He rushed downstairs. The lobby was dark, empty, except for one thing. A dusty black and white photograph on the wall. It showed the hotel in the 1950s. He leaned closer, and there it was, room 313's window, boarded up. He checked the date, 1957. Later, he'd find out that room had been sealed for years after a man named Harold Brenner took his own life there. They say he stood in front of the mirror and whispered to it for hours before doing it. And no matter how many times they removed the mirror, it always came back. Evan never went back. But sometimes when it rains and he catches his reflection in windows, elevator doors, even puddles on the street, he sees that same reflection, bloodstained, mouthing the same phrase. You left me, and now just between us, have you looked into a mirror lately? Really looked? Did your reflection blink at the exact moment you did? Or was it just a little late? Because if it was, maybe someone's still waiting. For you, Story 2, The Tenant Upstairs. Can you still hear the rain? Don't answer out loud. Just feel it. Let it fall into your ears like soft whispers. Let it settle around your shoulders like a heavy blanket. And while you sit there, wherever you are, I want you to ask yourself something. Who lives above you? Is there someone in the room right above yours? Can you hear their footsteps sometimes? Can you tell what time they go to bed? Now, let me ask this. Have you ever been sure someone was there, but when you checked, no one was? This story begins with a woman named Claire. She had just moved into a small apartment building in a quiet part of Oregon. Nothing special, just one of those old brick complexes built in the 50s. For floors, narrow staircases, old elevator that groaned every time it moved. But it was cheap, safe, and surrounded by tall pine trees. Claire loved the smell of rain on pine needles. It reminded her of childhood summers. She lived on the 3rd floor, apartment 3B. The first night, she heard footsteps overhead, slow, dragging, deliberate, back and forth. A soft thud every few seconds, as if someone was pacing with heavy shoes on hardwood. She looked up from her book, mildly annoyed. It was nearly 11 p.m., but it was an apartment after all. Noise was expected. The next morning, she passed the property manager on the way out. A friendly man named Greg, older, hunched, always in a dusty flannel shirt. She casually asked, "Hey, do you know who's in 4B? I could hear them pacing all night." Greg stopped walking. then said, "For BS Empty has been since October." Claire frowned. "Are you sure? I heard." "I'm sure," he cut in. He looked uncomfortable. "I just finished repainting it last week. No one's lived there in months." She let it go. That night it rained again, and once more the footsteps began. Back and forth, back and forth. Every few seconds, the same dragging thud, as if someone had nowhere else to go but couldn't stop walking. She recorded the sound on her phone. The audio was faint, but it was there. Clear footsteps, measured, repetitive. The next morning, she played it back for Greg. He sighed long and low. "You're not the first tenant to bring this up," he said. He didn't meet her eyes. She asked, "What do you mean?" He hesitated. Then, almost in a whisper, said, "There was someone, years ago, lived in 4B, a man named Ellis." Claire listened, rain tapping softly on her jacket. Greg continued. He kept to himself. People said he was strange. Never left his apartment during the day. Only walked at night, always pacing, over and over. Then one day, we just didn't see him anymore. "What happened to him?" Claire asked. "No one really knows. We went in after a week of silence. Found his apartment completely untouched, but he was gone." She asked if he'd moved. Greg shook his head. There were things in that apartment. Strange things. Claire pushed for details. Greg wouldn't give them. That night, she tried to sleep early. Told herself it was old pipes, shifting floorboards, an echo from another unit. But around midnight, the pacing started again. Only this time, it stopped right above her bed. She lay frozen. No music, no TV, no explanation, just silence. And then a tap from above, like someone slowly, deliberately tapping their foot. She got up, grabbed her broom, and hit the ceiling once. The tapping stopped, and then a knock, but not on the ceiling, on her front door. She turned slowly, heart pounding, opened it. No one was there, just the hallway, silent and empty. The only sound was the rain against the hallway window. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. And yet, every night after that, the footsteps returned, always around the same time, always the same pattern. She became obsessed. She set up cameras, audio recorders, even climbed the stairs one night at 3 a.m. and pressed her ear against the door 4B. Inside, she heard breathing. Not the kind you hear when someone is sleeping, but something slower, more deliberate, a breath that was waiting. She backed away, told herself she was imagining things. But one night, everything changed. She woke to the sound of something falling above her, a loud crash, then dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. She grabbed her phone, called Greg, begged him come check it out. Greg arrived 20 minutes later. Together, they climbed the stairs. Claire's hands trembled as he unlocked the door. They stepped into 4B. The room was spotless. No furniture. Fresh white paint on the walls. Empty, except in the center of the room, there was a pair of footprints. Wet footprints, leading from the center of the room to the corner where the wall met the floor, as if someone had been standing, watching, and on the far wall, in the paint, deep scratch marks. 4 of them, long, uneven, as if someone had tried to claw their way out or claw their way in. Greg turned white. He locked the door, told Claire to forget it, but she couldn't. The next day, she noticed something strange. The pacing above her no longer started at midnight. It started when she went to bed and stopped when she got up. It mimicked her. It watched her. One night, she stayed up on the couch, lights off, heart pounding. At exactly 2:17 a.m., she heard it. Not footsteps, breathing, but this time not from above. It was coming through the vent, near the corner of her living room. She crawled over slowly, barely breathing, and from inside the vent, she heard, "Why did you leave?" She screamed, moved out that week. Months later, the apartment complex burned down in an unexplained electrical fire. No one was hurt, but when they cleared the wreckage, firefighters reported something strange. The only room untouched by flames. 4B, inside, carved into the wall, over and over and over, was a sentence. Still walking, still watching, still here. Now, let me ask you again. Do you hear anything above you? Are you sure it's just footsteps? Or is it someone trying to come back? Story 3, The Forgotten Room. Do you remember what your childhood bedroom looked like? Try it now. Close your eyes, even if just for a moment. Can you picture the walls? The position of your bed? The smell of the blankets? What toys were where? Now, imagine finding out that there was another room, a room in your childhood home that you had completely forgotten, a room no one talked about, that no one else remembered, but somehow you did. This is the story of James. He was a quiet man, lived alone, taught literature at a small university in Vermont, didn't have many friends, but that never seemed to bother him. He liked silence, rainy days, old books, old houses, old stories. When his mother passed away, James inherited the house he grew up in, a 2-story Victorian tucked deep in the woods, 5 miles from the nearest gas station. He hadn't been back in over 20 years. Walking through it again was like entering a dream frozen in time. The same carpet, same creaky steps, dust clinging to the air like memory. It took him 2 full days to sort through her things. Mostly clothes, letters, half-empty bottles of perfume that still smelled like Sunday mornings. But on the 3rd night, something happened. He was walking through the 2nd floor hallway, flashlight in hand, because the power had gone out when he passed by a wall that felt off. You know that feeling when your body knows something before your mind does? The wallpaper here didn't match the rest. The wooden molding ended abruptly, and when he tapped the wall, it echoed, hollow. A few hours later, using a crowbar, he peeled away the panel, and behind it was a door, a small white wooden door, no taller than 4 feet. It had no handle, just a brass keyhole that was tarnished and crusted with time. The strange thing was, James remembered this door. He remembered it from a dream he had when he was a child. In the dream, he opened it, and something inside whispered, "Don't forget me." He thought it was just his mind playing tricks, a mix of grief, fatigue, and childhood imagination. But the door was real. He spent the next day searching the house for keys, in drawers and old coats, under rugs, and in his mother's jewelry box. He found it, a small, ancient key with the initials JB carved into the base. He didn't know anyone in the family with those initials. That night, with the wind howling outside and the rain starting to fall, James inserted the key into the lock. It clicked. He opened the door. Behind it was a staircase, narrow, dusty, descending into the dark. This didn't make sense. He'd lived in this house his entire childhood. There was no basement under this part of the house. And yet, here it was, He went down, flashlight shaking in his hand. The stairs creaked with every step. The walls grew tighter, closer, until finally he reached the bottom, and what he found was a room. A small room, square, old toys on a shelf, a child's bed, dust floating in the beam of his flashlight like slow snow. And on the wall, photos of him. James, at age 6, 7, 9, but he didn't remember these photos. Worse, he was wearing clothes in them he had never owned, and behind him, in every photo, was a girl. Same age, blonde hair, wide glassy eyes, but her face was always blurred, not by motion, as if someone had scratched her out. Carefully, methodically, he checked the frame of one photo. On the back, in faded ink, James and Bethany. Summer, 1991. He whispered the name out loud. Bethany. It echoed in the room like a bell. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered. He tapped it. The light returned. That's when he noticed something else. On the small child bed lay a stuffed rabbit. Old, torn, with a ribbon around its neck. He picked it up and whispered again. Bethany. He didn't know why. He didn't remember her. But saying her name felt right and wrong. All at once. That night he dreamt. He was back in that room. But the walls were red. The floor was wet. And the girl, Bethany, stood at the foot of the bed. Her face was clear now. Eyes black. Mouth open. Skin pale like ash. She looked at him and whispered, "Why did you forget me?" He woke up screaming. The next morning, he went back down. The door was gone. Just a wall. As if it had never been there. But the stuffed rabbit was in his hands. Wet. Smelling of soil. He left the house that week. Moved back to the city. Tried to forget. But every now and then, when it rains, he wakes up with dirt under his fingernails. And one night, not long ago, he found something under his bed. An old photograph of him at age 8, next to the girl. Bethany. Only now, her face wasn't scratched out. It was smiling, and in her lap was a rabbit on the back of the photo. Don't forget me again. Story 4. The journal in the floorboards. The rain hasn't stopped, has it? Do you hear it tapping on your window? Or is it just in your headphones? Doesn't matter. The rhythm is the same. Soft, unforgiving, endless. Let me ask you, have you ever found something in an old house that shouldn't have been there? Not a photo, not an object. Something personal. Something that belongs to someone who never existed. Or maybe someone who no longer does. This story begins with a man named Noah. Noah was a preservation architect. His job was to document and prepare crumbling old buildings for restoration or demolition. He didn't scare easily. Old places were full of creaks, shadows, drafts. He saw them as dying lungs exhaling their last breaths. But there was one house he was sent to survey that never stopped breathing. It stood deep in the countryside of Maine, 3 hours from the nearest town, hidden behind trees that clawed at the wind. The client wanted the house documented before tearing it down. Noah arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was gray. Rain drizzled down, coating the windshield like a film of sorrow. The house had no path leading to it, no driveway, no signs of human presence for decades. And yet, the front door was ajar. He stepped inside. The air was thick, not just with dust, with something older, like mildew and memory. Wallpaper peeled from the walls like shedding skin. Cobwebs hung like curtains. And in the center of the house was a wooden staircase, each step a whisper under his boots. Noah began taking photos, notes, sketches, room by room, floor by floor, until he entered what appeared to be a child's bedroom. It was nearly intact. A small bed, a rocking chair, and a floorboard in the center that looked newer than the rest. He crouched, tapped it, hollow. He pried it open with the edge of his flashlight. Inside, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine, was a journal. Its leather cover was cracked, stained. The pages yellowed, edges curled, but the ink was fresh, as if it had been written just days ago. He flipped to the first page. There was no name, only the title, "For the One Who Finds Me." The entries were dated, but they didn't make sense. Some were from 1923, others from 1978. Some had no year, just a phrase. "Rain again." Can't remember when it started. The writing changed. Different hands, different styles. But the voice was always the same. It began as rambling thoughts, complaints about the weather, about dreams. Then it turned. Each entry became darker. Mentions of whispers from the walls, of figures outside the window, tall, thin, never blinking, of nights that lasted too long, where time stopped moving. And then this line, "There's something buried beneath the house. It hums at night." Noah felt a cold breath pass through the room. He checked his watch. An hour had passed, but he had only read 3 pages. He kept going. The entries began addressing him directly. "Are you reading this now? You shouldn't have come here. I can hear you breathing." He froze, looked around. The house was silent, except for the creaking from downstairs, slow, measured, as if someone had just stepped inside. He stuffed the journal into his bag, heart racing, and left. Didn't lock the door, didn't look back. That night in the motel, he opened the journal again. There were new entries, written in ink still wet. They described the motel room, the placement of the lamp, the angle of his feet, the color of his thoughts, and at the bottom of the page, "Stop reading. Come back." He tore the page out, burned it in the bathroom sink. The next morning, the burned page was back in the journal, intact, with one addition. You can't destroy what remembers you. Noah quit the job, told the client the house was unstable. But the journal never left. He tried throwing it away. It reappeared on his pillow. He left it at a church. It showed up in his mailbox. He buried it and found it in his backpack, wet with dirt. Now, when it rains, the entries write themselves. He reads them aloud sometimes. Not because he wants to, because he has to. And you're hearing this now. Maybe it's writing about you already. Maybe the next line in the journal is, "They're listening in the rain." Story 5. The village that wasn't there yesterday. Can you still hear it? The rain, soft, persistent, a rhythm older than language. The kind of sound that opens doorways if you're not careful. I want you to pay close attention to where you are right now. Look around. Do you recognize everything in the room? Are you sure that chair was there a minute ago? Or that the hallway outside your door has always been the same length? This is the kind of story that plays with memory, not by accident, but by design. It begins with a man named Victor. Victor was an urban explorer, the kind who hunted forgotten places with nothing but a flashlight, a camera, and a stubborn desire to go where no one else would. Abandoned hospitals, burnt down theaters, ghost towns swallowed by sand. But one place found him. It was a night just like this. He had been driving through a fog-drenched region of northern Wyoming, returning from an old mining settlement he had spent the day photographing. As the rain thickened, his GPS glitched. The screen flashed, froze, then rerouted him down a side road that didn't seem to exist. A single-lane, cracked asphalt path lined with pine trees. He could have turned back, but the explorer in him was curious. After 10 miles, the road ended at a wooden archway, carved into the arch. Velgrave. No mention of it on any map. No history online. No population signs. Just a word. And beyond it, houses. Old. Stone-built. Tiled roofs that sloped too sharply. Windows too narrow. Chimneys that looked like fingers reaching toward the clouds. Victor stepped out of his car, camera in hand, and realized there were no sounds, no birds, no wind. Even the rain was silent once he passed under the arch. He whispered to himself just to check, and didn't hear his own voice. It was as if sound had been suspended, but that didn't stop him. He wandered the main street, taking photos, shops with signs in a language he didn't recognize, benches carved from a single piece of wood, a fountain in the square, but no water, no people, not even signs that people had ever lived there. Then he noticed the statues, dozens of them, scattered throughout the village, human-shaped, but their faces were blank. Smooth stone, no features. Some sat, some stood, some looked like they were running, or trying to. He zoomed in with his camera. Stone, definitely stone, but there was something wrong with the shadows. They didn't match the angle of the rain. He shrugged it off, continued exploring. Eventually, he reached a chapel. Small, wood-roofed, no cross, just a circular symbol carved into the door. 12 marks around a ring. One was deeper, fresh. He stepped inside. The air smelled like ash and lavender. Candles lined the walls, lit but not flickering. And at the front, where an altar should have been, was a mirror. Old, cracked, but the surface shimmered like water. He lifted his camera, clicked. The photo didn't show the room. It showed him, standing in the village square, at night, with the statues moving behind him. He looked at the screen, looked back at the mirror. The surface rippled. And then he saw something behind him, not in the mirror, in the chapel, one of the statues. It had followed him. He turned. Nothing there, but the doorway was now blocked by a second statue. He hadn't seen that one enter. He stepped back. The air grew thicker, and now he could hear again, but not the rain. Whispers, low, circular, chanting, a language his brain didn't understand, but his bones did. The mirror flashed. He saw himself again, only now he was one of them. A statue, arms frozen mid-motion, face blank. He ran, out of the chapel, into the square. But the streets had changed. They were longer, twisting. Some looped back on themselves. Some led into nothing. He saw his car at the end of one path, ran for it. But every time he turned, the statue was closer, moving when unseen, stopping when looked at. Some had mouths now, open, wide, as if screaming in silence. He reached the car, locked the doors, started the engine. It roared backward. The car moved in reverse on its own, deeper into Velgrave. He screamed, and finally heard his own voice again. The spell had broken, or paused. He threw the door open and ran into the woods. Didn't stop until he collapsed in the rain. Crawled until the trees thinned, and he found the highway again. A trucker picked him up at dawn. He told no one, deleted the photos, destroyed the camera. But 2 weeks later, a package arrived at his door. No return address. Inside his SD card. And a single photo printed on thick paper. The village square. Empty, except for one statue. Standing alone. Camera in hand. Blank face. And written in pen at the bottom. Welcome back. Story 6. I keep waking up in the wrong version of my life. Are you awake right now? Are you sure you're awake? Wait, don't answer yet. Don't just assume. Look around. Slowly, taking the walls. The ceiling. How does the light fall in the room? Is it exactly how you remember it yesterday? Is the air just a little heavier? Listen to the rain for a moment. That soft, consistent rhythm. You hear it too, don't you? Good. Now, let me take you somewhere. This is a story about a man named Eli, and I need you to stay with me, because what happened to him might already be happening to you, and the only way to know for sure is to pay attention. Eli lived what most people would call a normal life. He had a good job in IT support, worked remote from home, had a kind wife named Emma. They lived in a small, warm house with yellow curtains in the kitchen, and a dog named Beans who always barked at delivery drivers. Nothing extraordinary, but peaceful. And then one night, while the rain whispered on the windows and Emma was already asleep beside him, Eli closed his eyes and woke up somewhere else. At first, he thought it was a dream, a lucid dream, maybe. Everything looked similar, but not quite right. The ceiling fan above the bed was spinning clockwise instead of counterclockwise. The window that usually faced the backyard now showed a view of the street. The wallpaper in the hallway had a subtle blue floral pattern he had never seen before. And Emma wasn't Emma. She looked similar. Same voice, same warmth. Same scent on her skin when she kissed him good morning. But her name was Rachel. She smiled at him with a familiarity that made his stomach turn. You were out cold last night, she said, handing him a coffee in a mug that said, to the best husband. He stared at her. Where's Emma? Rachel blinked. Who's Emma? He looked around the kitchen. The toaster was in the wrong place. The magnets on the fridge spelled out unfamiliar names. And there was a calendar for a year that didn't exist, 2028. The photo on the wall showed them, him and Rachel, on a beach he'd never visited, smiling, happy. His heart started pounding. He closed his eyes, tried to breathe, tried to force himself awake. He passed out and woke up back in his bed. Rain still tapping. Emma next to him, breathing softly. Everything normal. He wanted to believe it was a dream, maybe a trick of the brain. But part of him knew something had changed. The following week, it happened again. Then again, and again. Sometimes the shifts were subtle. Emma's hair was longer. The house had a second bathroom it never had before. Other times, the changes were seismic. He had a different job, lived in a different city, was married to someone else, or not married at all. And the most terrifying thing, each time he arrived in a new version of his life, everyone recognized him. They remembered things he didn't. They spoke of moments that never happened, and they told stories of him. Being someone he didn't remember being, he began documenting it. A journal, handwritten, paper only. He didn't trust digital anymore. He recorded dates, changes, dreams, side details like the scent of the soap in each version, how the sunlight hit the walls, what kind of coffee he drank. And slowly, he started noticing something far more disturbing than the shifting worlds. The versions were looping. One morning, he woke up in a version of his life where everything was perfect. Back with Emma. Same job, same kitchen, everything how it should be. He cried, hugged her tightly, said he was sorry. She looked at him, confused. What happened? He said, I think I came back. She asked, from where? He didn't know how to answer. Later that night, he opened his journal to write it all down and found the page already written. Same details, same words, same tears. Only, the entry was dated 4 months earlier. He flipped through the book. More entries he didn't remember writing. Conversations he hadn't had yet. Memories of places he didn't know existed. And all of them ended with the same phrase, in his handwriting. You are not alone in here. The next morning, the mirror in the bathroom fogged up as he took a shower. When he stepped out, 3 words were written in the condensation. Pick a side. He asked Emma if she wrote it. She shook her head, pale. I was asleep. That night, the rain came again, harder than ever, like it was trying to drown the sky. He fell asleep around 1 a.m. and woke up in darkness. Not his bed, not any place he recognized. He was lying on the floor, stone, wet, cold. He sat up coughing, looked around. He was inside a massive room, like cathedral, but without windows, doors, or walls. Just columns, disappearing upward into nothing. And around him were others. All of them looked like him. Dozens, maybe more, all wearing different clothes. Some older, some younger, some bleeding, some staring at him in silence. One stepped forward. Only one of us gets to stay, it said. He ran. Somehow he escaped. Woke up in a version of his life that seemed familiar again. But something is off. Every time he looks into the mirror now, the man staring back is just a little slower. A blink delayed. A smirk that fades too late. Eyes that don't look afraid, because they're not his. He stopped sleeping last week. But it doesn't matter, because the version of him that's in control now isn't the original. Now, let me ask you one last time. Are you sure you're in the correct version of your life right now? Do the people around you feel slightly off? Is your reflection moving exactly when you do? Are the sounds in your room perfectly matched with your memory of them? If even one thing feels wrong, maybe you're not the one who woke up this time. And if that's true, then the real you is still out there, trapped, watching, waiting.